Alrighty, so now that we have our server or service infrastructure in place, we can start working on the API calls that have to do with authentication and registration. So we already have the user interface pretty much put together. We have our login activities and our register activities and all that fun stuff. And we have our forms and our external login pages and all that stuff already written. But right now it doesn't really do anything. It's not hooked into our service layer at all. So basically when you hit the login button, for example, it just pretends you're logged in. Like if you recall, inside of that's actually going to be inside of our login fragment. When we hit the button, when we click on the button, all it's going to do is it's going to pretend that we logged in by telling the user, set logged in is true and set display name to, in this case, Nelson LeKay. So what we want to do instead is we want to actually hook this into our service layer. Before we move on and start implementing the rest of the features of the application, I do want to I want to do this part so that when it comes time to actually hook up our application to our real live services, then all this code will be written. In addition, we're going to have to discuss our authentication tokens, or exactly how it is we're going to handle the API calls to our web service. So, for example, if we wanted to list our inbox, if we wanted to, that seemed like a reasonable thing to do in this application, if we wanted to go and we wanted to list our inbox, we need to hit a API endpoint online on some sort of service, and we need to be able to send some little token, some little bit of information that indicates that we are logged in and we're authenticated. Kind of like how a cookie would work if you were using a browser. Well, the way that I'm going to implement this is using a really straightforward concept of a authentication token, where when you log in, when you actually perform a successful login, the server on the other end is going to generate a random token and hand it back to the application. And then if the application needs to make another request to the server, it will pass along that authentication token, allowing the server to validate or verify that you are a valid user, and more importantly, to find out what user you are, what user is making that particular request. In addition, we are going to take that authentication token and we're going to store it in the local storage of the application, so that if you were to close the application and relaunch it, the application would know that you were logged in and re-authenticate itself with the service. So that's how we're going to handle this. So yeah, I guess the best way to go about doing this would be to put together in this video, stub out all of the individual service calls that we need to do, all the individual events that we're going to need to write in order to work with this. And for each event, I'll talk about where it's going to be used. We won't hook in the code just yet. We're just going to be writing the events in this video, as well as we're going to be modifying our authentication class a little bit. So I guess let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to jump over here into my services package, and I'm going to go into the account class, and this is where I'm going to put all of my account-related events. So it's going to include logging in, verifying authentication tokens, and registering. So I guess at this point it's just a matter of going down the list. I'm going to start off with something a little interesting though, and I'm going to do it up here near the top of the class. I'm going to write another class here, and it's not going to be a request or a response. It's not going to be an event that's going to be passed along with our service bus. Instead, what it's going to be is it's going to be a base class for our service responses that represent a service call that resulted in the user being successfully logged in. So why am I doing this? Well, the reason is there's a variety of ways to log into this application. You can log in from an external service like Facebook, or you can log in using a username and password combination. I want to write a base class for all of the responses so that I don't have to repeat myself for receiving information about a user. You'll see what I mean here in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say public static, and I'm going to call this a user response. So public static class user response, and he's going to inherit from service response. And then for his members, he's going to have a public string ID. Oops, public int ID, I mean. A public string, now we need our other parameters, such as our avatar URL. We're going to need our display name. We're going to need our username. And in this case, I'm going to capitalize the N to make it more consistent with our display name. And we're going to need our email. And we're going to need our auth token, as well as a boolean to indicate if we have a password. Okay, so here is our user response, and it contains all the information that a user needs to, all the information that a user account will have. So this you can think of as the prototypal response for all requests that end up logging in the user, so we get all that information back. So now that I've done that, let's go ahead and implement the first request response pair, the simplest one, in fact. At least the most straightforward one. So down here at the bottom of the class, I guess I could do this right underneath user response. It doesn't matter where I do this. The only reason I wanted the user response class up here near the top of the class is because it's different. It's not the request response pair that we've been used to writing. Anyway, we'll go ahead and create a public static class. And what's the first thing that I want to handle? I want to handle a user logging in with the username and password. Really, really simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a class called login with username request. And then login with username request is not surprisingly going to have a public string username and a public string password. And then for convenience, I'm going to go ahead and generate a constructor. So if you didn't catch that, that was Alt insert inner shift down arrow inner to generate that. Once you do it a couple times, it becomes really, really, really quick to do, and it saves you a whole lot of time. All right, next up, let's do the corresponding request. So this corresponding request will be a public static class login with username response, and he will inherit from user response. So you see what I did here. So I had this user response and it has all the information about the user, and then my login with username response, when the server returns that response, it's going to return all my account information. But now I don't have to repeat myself for the other login events. So again, where will this event be fired from? Well, it'll simply be fired under our resources layout login, or in this case, our fragment login. It'll be fired from right here. If you recall, we have our fragment login, or login fragment. So, yeah. Jumping back here, let's go ahead and write our next event, our next service API call that we're going to need to handle is going to be a little non-obvious. It's going to be logging in with a local token, a local authentication token. So I'm going to say public static class login with local token, and he's going to have a public string, and then we're just going to do auth token. And then I'll generate the constructor. And then for the response, it will be login, or whoops, this will login with local token request, of course, which will change that constructor name. Login with local token response, which will extend user response. So the login with local token, what this does is, let's imagine for a second that the user logs in with the username and password. And so he logs in, and the server returns with to him an authentication token, which you can see up here in our user response, that allows the server to uniquely identify this user. Now let's say the user shuts down the application, and let's say just restarts his phone, so memory is completely wiped, starts his phone back up, launches the application. Now he'll expect to be still logged in. What needs to happen, though, is the application needs to retrieve all of the information about the user. It needs to do two things. It needs to, A, retrieve all the information about the user, such as his email, his display name, and all that stuff. And he also needs to verify that the user is still properly logged in, or even that the user still exists. So because we can imagine that maybe between the user shutting down his phone and restarting it, and then he tries to log in again, or tries to launch the app again, that his account has been deleted. So we need a service API call that will ask the server if the authentication token that we previously received is still valid. And if it is, provide all the details about the user back to us. So that's what the login with local token is. And if this fails, if this API call fails, then what's going to happen is we're going to have to tell the user to log back in again. So to provide his username and password again. Okay, so that is our login with local token request. Next one will be interesting. Public static, we haven't talked about this much. Public static class login with external token request. And of course, we'll have a public string, and it'll be, in this case, it'll be provider. And then we're going to have a public string token, and then a public string client ID. And I'll go ahead and generate a constructor with all these parameters. So what's going on here? Actually, in fact, I don't even need to do that. I don't need to retrieve the client ID from a constructor parameter because it's always going to be Android. So what is this? Login with token request. And we'll have, of course, our public static class login with external token response, which will inherit from user response. So what this is when we have an external authentication provider, such as Google or Facebook, we need to be able to retrieve an authentication token from the corresponding OAuth providers, the open authentication providers on Facebook or Google. So you guys are all familiar with you go to an app, you say log in with Google, and then it pops up a web browser with Google's own login form. You fill that out, you hit next, and then you get back into the app and you're logged in. But you're logged in using an account from an external provider. Well, that's what this does. And what this does is once we on our client itself, in our application, we show the user a web browser and we have them log into Google or Facebook, and then that session will return us with a token. Then what we need to do is we need to send this token back to our server, our Euro server, to exchange the external token with a local token. So we need to exchange the token that Google or Facebook will give us for authentication with a token that's accepted and understood by the Euro servers themselves. And that's what the login with external token request does. So it has a provider, which is going to be like Google or Facebook, a token, which is the token that was returned during the authentication flow, and then a client ID. Now, the client ID is an interesting parameter here, and the reason I have it here and the reason I have it hard-coded will not seem immediately obvious, but it has to do with how I'm going to be using these classes in the future. I'm actually going to be using these classes to make the actual web requests to the actual server to avoid me having to repeat code. And as a result, I'm hard coding in a value that's always going to be sent to the server. So anyway, that's our login with external token stuff. All right, so that's our logging in. Those are all the things that we need to do in order to log in with our application. Let's move on to how it is we're going to go about registering. So registering is going to be pretty straightforward as well. We'll first have our public static class, and we'll do a register request. And the register request is going to have a public string username, public string email. This should look familiar now. These are all the fields that we have on that register form that we created all the ways back. Public string password, and we're also going to go ahead and have a public string client ID as well. And the client ID is going to do the same thing. We're simply going to say client ID equals Android. Okay, what about our register response? What do we need for that? Well, our register response, we've conveniently already basically written. It's going to be our user response. So our user response class is going to essentially be our register response, because the server is going to return back all the information such as the avatar URL, the display name, and most importantly, the auth token. So what's happening is when we register, when we hit the register button, we're not only creating an account, but we're logging in at the same time. And so that one API call will log us in as well as create the account. However, there's going to be one more register method that we need to write, and that's going to be our register with external token request. And for him, he's going to be very similar to the register request. We're going to have our username, our email, but he's not going to have a password, and he's also going to have an external provider. So we'll have provider, and he's also going to have a token, so our external token. And then let's go ahead and create our and then of course he'll also have his client ID. So then we'll go ahead and we'll do all that stuff, and we'll set client ID to Android. And then we're also going to have a public static class register with external token response, and our response is going to simply inherit from our user response. Okay, so what is this? Basically, what'll happen is when you log into Google or Facebook, when you're logging into an external provider, you will run into a circumstance where you don't have a local account on Euro. You don't have information provided such as your email or username or your settings or your preferences or your friend list or whatever. And if you don't have an account, then you need to create one. And so what's going to happen is when you log in with something like Google, for the first time, you're going to be redirected to an activity, that the register activity, which will ask you to fill in the missing bits, ask you what you want your display name to be, your username, your email, and all that fun stuff. And then when you register from there, it'll go ahead and create you a local account, as well as creating you a local token, which will allow you to log in. All right, so those are that's our API. That's our service. That's basically all the service calls that we need for our registration and our logging in. Now, we're not going to hook them up in this video just yet, but we will soon. I also want to go ahead and I want to implement one more event. And the interesting thing about this event is it's not going to be part of the request and response stuff. It's not going to have a request component and a response component. Instead, it's going to be a pure event. And I'm going to do it here at the bottom to kind of segregate it from the rest of these classes, but it still has very much to do with the concept of an account, so I'll leave it grouped into this main class. What it is I'm going to say public static class, and it's going to be user details updated, and I'm just going to say event. And then I'm going to say public user, and I'm going to import this from the infrastructure namespace, and then I'll create the appropriate constructor. So what's going on here is this is an event that's going to be dispatched to the event bus whenever a service call updates a user in any way. So, for example, if we change the user's avatar, change the display name, we need to let the rest of the system know that that happened. And that's what the purpose of this event is. So this will, like, for example, you guys remember how we have our profile layout. This guy right here that lets us choose our avatar and our display name. Now, what if we do that, and once we do this, we need to tell the rest of the application about it because, for example, we also have our nav drawer, and our nav drawer has our avatar and our display name. So our nav drawer has to get updated whenever the profile makes a change. And so we're going to accomplish that interaction by having a user details updated event that other components can listen for. And whenever that happens, it'll update the avatar and the display name. We'll hook that up later. The last thing I want to go ahead and do in this video is I want to make some modifications to my auth class. So my auth class, under infrastructure auth, is the guy that kind of contains our user, but he does a little bit more than that, or he needs to do a little bit more than that. I also want this auth class to keep track of whether or not we have an authentication token already. So remember how I said once you log into the application, and you close the application, start back up, I want you to still be logged in. How do you accomplish that? You accomplish it with an authentication token. So we have that authentication token and we store it in the application's shared preferences. And shared preferences are a really straightforward key value store in Android. So let me go ahead and show you guys how to go about doing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create some private static final string auth preferences, private static final string preferences token. So we're going to need some magic strings later down the file. So we start off by declaring two private constant strings. Then what I'm going to do is down here, underneath my private final context, I'm going to say private final shared preferences, and I'm going to say underscore preferences. Then what I'm going to do is underneath our private user, I'm going to say private, oops, I don't want an underscore there, a private string auth token, which will store a reference to our current auth token. Now, inside of the constructor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish our preferences. And I'll talk about what's going on here in a second after I write this out so you guys see what the code looks like. So our shared preferences is in Android this sort of key value store where I can store little bits of data that are indexed by string keys. And you see that I'm getting it from the context, in this case from the application, and I'm getting a shared preferences object, and I'm passing in which shared preference, what's the name of the shared preferences that I want. And in this case, I'm passing in the magic string auth preferences. And it doesn't so much matter what you pass in here, as long as it's used with that in the application in the same way. So as long as any other thing that needs to get a reference to the shared preferences needs to know this string, this auth preferences string. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter. It's all arbitrary. Now that I have a reference to my shared preference key value store, which will be persisted when the application gets shut off and turned back on, I can go ahead and get a reference to my auth token, or see if my auth token has been added to my shared preferences by saying auth token equals preferences.getString auth preferences token, and then for my default value pass in null. So what this is doing is this is saying go get from the shared preferences object a value, a string in this case, as you see get string, that is keyed by this particular key, in this case auth preferences token. And if you couldn't find it, return null to indicate that this key hasn't been set yet. All right, so let's go ahead and jump down, and I'm going to create a couple methods, some simple accessors first. I'm going to say get auth token, and it's simply going to say return. What are you doing? Stop that madness. Return auth token. And then I'm going to say public boolean has auth token. And the has auth token will simply return auth token does not equal null and not auth token.empty. So this will ask if we have an auth token stored anywhere. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public void set auth token, which will have a string auth token parameter. And for set auth token, we're simply going to say this auth token equals auth token. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to store the auth token back in shared preferences. So to store values back into a shared preferences, you need to get a reference to an object called the shared preferences editor. So to do that, I'm going to say shared preferences.editor, editor equals preferences.edit. And so the edit method of the shared preferences object returns this editor object. Now that I have a reference to this editor object, I can make changes to my shared preferences, such as saying editor.putString auth preferences token, and then pass an auth token. So now we're storing the auth token. Then I can commit the changes by doing editor.commit. So this will save all of the changes I just made back into the shared preferences, so that the next time this application is restarted, we now have our reference to our auth token. The last thing I want to do in this class is create a public void logout method. And the logout method is pretty straightforward. It's first going to clear out our auth token by saying set auth token null. So that'll clear out the existing auth token, which is important because the next time the application launches, it's not going to try to use the old auth token to log in. Then what I need to do is I need to clear out the task and restart it in the login activity. So I need to basically restart the application and jump all the way back into the login activity. We've already seen an example of how to do this earlier in the series, so when we talked about intents and intent flags, so this should look familiar. I'm going to say intent, login intent equals new intent, passing in context for my context, and login activity.class for my activity. Then I'm going to say login intent dot set flags intent flag activity clear task and intent dot flag activity new task. And then I'm going to say context dot start activity and pass in login intent. So you invoke the login method, it clears out the auth token from our shared preferences, and then it clears out the entire application and restarts it, restarts it on the login activity. And yeah, that's basically how we're going to log out. I'm not going to worry about this warning right here. It says it's saying that the shared preferences commit method is going to block the main thread, and I'm fine with that. I don't want this to be delayed. I want the setting the auth token to happen synchronously and not asynchronously, in case there is some code that needs to retrieve or re-retrieve the auth token from the shared preferences after we've invoked the set auth token. You can imagine, for example, if the shared preferences didn't commit synchronously, if we were to log out, clear the auth token, and then reread in the auth token and think that we're still logged in, that would introduce a bug. By doing editor.commit, even though it's warning me that it's going to happen synchronously, will potentially prevent some nasty race conditions from happening. So I'm okay with a slight, however many millisecond delay there might be on the main thread, if it means I don't have to worry about race conditions. Anyway, that's really about it. That wraps up our, at least just the individual events that we needed to implement to hook up our authentication. So in the next video, we're going to go about actually starting to work with these events in the code. Or no, we're going to start, well, by work with, I mean implement their dummy sort of implementations in our in-memory services. All right, I guess we'll see you guys in the next video.